January 17, 1945. Luzon, Philippine Islands. 0547 hours. The sky above Lingayen Gulf hung heavy with pre-dawn mist, thick as cotton soaked in diesel and salt water. Along the volcanic sand beaches of San Fabian, Japanese Lieutenant Takashi Nakamura pressed his body against the earthen wall of his bunker, feeling the tremor of distant naval guns roll through the compacted soil like the breathing of some enormous beast. He had been awake for 31 hours. His uniform, once the proud khaki of the Imperial Japanese Army, now bore the stains of 3 years in the Pacific rust-colored mud. Sweat turned to salt, and the peculiar yellow dust that rose from shattered concrete. In his hands, he clutched a Type 38 rifle, its wood stock cracked along the grain from humidity and neglect. The magazine held 5 rounds. He had 17 more in his ammunition pouch. Somewhere behind him, deeper in the coconut groves that the American battleships had turned into a forest of broken toothpicks, his remaining 23 men waited in spider holes and covered trenches, their orders simple and absolute. Hold the beach until death, inflict maximum casualties, die with honor for the emperor. Nakamura had studied at the military academy in Tokyo. He had read the translations of American war manuals captured at Bataan. He understood intellectually what firepower meant in the American vocabulary. He had witnessed the bombardments at Saipan through binoculars from a hospital ship before his transfer to Luzon. He had seen the photographs of Tarawa's shattered defenses, had listened to survivors describe the cascading explosions that turned coral fortifications into white powder. But understanding and experiencing are separated by an ocean of human perception. What arrived in Lingayen Gulf that morning would collapse that ocean into a single, eternal moment of comprehension. A moment when the theoretical became devastatingly, horrifyingly real. Through the gun slit of his bunker, Nakamura watched the shapes on the water. The American invasion fleet stretched to both horizons, more ships than he could count, their gray hulls emerging from darkness like a city materializing from fog. He recognized the silhouettes. Battleships with their pagoda masts, cruisers with their raked funnels, the squat profiles of destroyers. But there were others, strange vessels he had never seen in any identification manual. Flat, graceless, with squared-off bows that looked less like warships and more like floating warehouses. They moved slowly, deliberately, positioning themselves in a line parallel to the beach, perhaps 800 meters offshore. Landing ship, tank, the Americans called them. LST. Nakamura had read the intelligence reports. These were cargo vessels, transport ships designed to run their bows onto beaches and disgorge tanks and trucks directly onto sand. They were not combat vessels. They carried no significant armament beyond defensive machine guns and perhaps a single 5-inch gun on the stern. The intelligence reports were catastrophically, fatally wrong. At 0612 hours, the first LST launched its rockets. The weapon that would horrify Lieutenant Nakamura and reshape Japanese tactical doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War was born not from martial genius but from desperate improvisation. In the cramped offices of the Bureau of Ships in Washington, D.C., naval engineers had confronted a problem as old as amphibious warfare itself: how to suppress beach defenses in the final minutes before landing craft touched sand, when troops were most vulnerable and conventional naval gunfire had to cease to avoid hitting friendly forces. The gap between the last naval shell and the first boot on the beach was measured in minutes, but it was a gap measured in blood. At Tarawa in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division had suffered over 3,000 casualties, many in those final 200 meters when Japanese machine guns, emerging from bunkers the naval bombardment had failed to destroy, found their range against men wading through waist-deep water. The solution came from British experience in the Mediterranean. Royal Navy engineers had mounted racks of rocket projectors on converted landing craft, creating floating batteries capable of saturating invasion beaches with explosive projectiles in rapid succession. The Americans, characteristically, took the concept and scaled it to industrial proportions. By early 1945, the U.S. Navy had modified dozens of LSTs, removing their vehicle cargo capacity and installing, instead a forest of steel launching rails, 1,080 tubes per vessel, arranged in ranks that covered nearly the entire forward deck. Each tube held a 4.5-inch M8 rocket, originally designed for the Army's truck-mounted artillery. The rockets were crewed by precision standards, Unguided, fin-stabilized, accurate only in the aggregate, but accuracy was not the point. Volume was the point. Saturation was the point. Each LST could launch its entire payload in less than 90 seconds, dropping more than 5,000 pounds of high explosive onto a beach area roughly the size of 4 football fields. A single salvo from one rocket-equipped LST delivered the equivalent firepower of an entire artillery battalion firing in unison. The Americans, in their systematic way, had designated these vessels LSM, R, landing ship medium, rocket, though the men who crewed them preferred simpler names: mighty midgets, rocket boats, or most commonly, floating artillery. The Japanese had no equivalent weapon. They had no doctrinal answer for it. They had not, in their most pessimistic intelligence assessments, imagined it was possible. Lieutenant Nakamura's war ended in the first 3 seconds of the barrage. The sound arrived before his mind could process the visual stimulus. Not individual explosions, but a continuous tearing roar, as if the sky itself were being ripped apart by enormous hands. The bunker's gun slit became a rectangle of pure white light, pulsing, strobing, too bright to look at directly. The earth heaved. Dust and small stones rained from the bunker's log-in-earth ceiling. Through the ringing in his ears, Nakamura heard himself shouting something, though he could not hear his own voice. The walls compressed inward, released, compressed again, as if the bunker were breathing. A lance of white phosphorus, bright as magnesium, speared through the gun slit and embedded itself in the back wall, hissing, spreading chemical fire that could not be extinguished by water. Nakamura threw himself flat, pressed his face into the dirt floor that smelled of mold and explosives, and discovered that his bowels had released without his conscious knowledge or control. The rockets fell without pause or pattern, overlapping, layering destruction upon destruction. Each projectile carried a 6-pound warhead, enough to collapse a bunker roof, shred sandbag revetments, or turn human bodies into components. But the true horror was not individual explosive power. It was density, concentration, the mathematical certainty that every square meter of the beach defenses would receive multiple impacts within the span of a commercial break. Nakamura's bunker took 3 direct hits in the first 30 seconds. The first collapsed the forward observation port, burying the machine gun position under half a ton of sand and shattered coconut logs. The second penetrated the roof 18 inches from where Nakamura lay, but failed to detonate, embedding itself like a tombstone in the earthen floor. The third struck the bunker's left flank, where the ammunition supply had been stored: 40 wooden crates of rifle rounds, 6 boxes of grenades, and 8 drums of machine gun belts. The explosion that followed was not a sound but a physical presence, a wall of pressure that compressed Nakamura's chest until he was certain his ribs would collapse inward like a crushed paper lantern. When he could see again, seconds or minutes later, time had become elastic, unreliable. The bunker was gone. One wall remained partially. The rest had been redistributed across the beach in fragments too small to identify. Of the 6 men who had sheltered with him, he found pieces of 3. The machine gun had vanished entirely, possibly vaporized, possibly buried under the tons of displaced earth. Nakamura rose to his knees, then to his feet, swaying, his equilibrium shattered by blast concussion. His rifle was gone. His helmet was gone. He still wore his boots, though the left one had lost its soul. The landscape had been transformed into something alien, lunar. Every palm tree within 200 meters had been reduced to ragged stumps, their fronds and trunks simply erased. The communication trench that had connected his position to the command bunker 300 meters inland had filled with sand and debris, its route marked only by occasional glimpses of shattered duckboard. The vegetation, the careful camouflage, the interlocking fields of fire they had prepared for 3 months. All of it gone, replaced by a smoking moonscape of overlapping craters, each crater's edge touching the next. The barrage lasted 7 minutes and 40 seconds by the chronometer on the command ship. To the Japanese defenders, it existed outside time, a geological age compressed into eternal present tense. Captain James Ridley, commanding officer of LSM, R-194, watched the barrage through binoculars from the conning station, his body absorbing the rhythmic shudder of rocket launches through his boots. He was 31 years old, a reserve officer from Pennsylvania, a civil engineer in peacetime who had designed highway bridges across the Susquehanna River. The Navy had given him 4 weeks of training in amphibious warfare and command of a vessel he had never seen before reporting aboard. The crew called him Skipper with varying degrees of irony. He had never fired a weapon in anger before this morning. Now he was orchestrating an apocalypse. "Commence firing all racks," he said into the speaking tube, his voice calm, almost bored, the tone they had trained him to adopt, the voice that suggested this was routine, normal, just another day's work in the business of industrial warfare. The forward racks lit first, a rippling cascade of ignition that ran from port to starboard like a wave of steel lightning. Each rocket motor ignited with a harsh crack whoosh, trailing a comet tail of white smoke and orange sparks. The initial launches were almost elegant, graceful arcs that climbed away from the ship in synchronized flight. But as the firing sequence accelerated, elegance dissolved into chaos. Smoke engulfed the forward deck, thick and acrid, heavy with cordite and burning propellant. The rockets overlapped in flight, dozens in the air simultaneously, their trails braiding and diverging, creating geometric patterns that existed for microseconds before dissolving. The noise was omnipresent, physical, a wall of sound that rendered speech impossible and reduced human communication to hand signals and gestures. Ridley felt the vibration in his molars, in his joints, in the hollow spaces of his skull. Through the smoke and chaos, he maintained his binoculars on the beach. The first impacts were visible as white flashes, sharp and clean against the gray-green of the vegetation line. Then the flashes merged, became continuous, a flickering curtain of fire that obscured all detail. He could see trees falling, earth geysering upward in dark fountains, structures collapsing. But these were peripheral details, glimpsed between smoke clouds, fragmentary impressions of comprehensive destruction. The beach itself seemed to be moving, writhing, as if the land were alive and in pain. Ridley lowered his binoculars and checked his wristwatch. For minutes elapsed, half the payload expended. He nodded to the gunnery officer, who relayed commands through the speaking tube network that connected every launcher station. The firing continued without pause. Ridley had read the operational analysis reports from the Marianas campaign, the dry statistical language of military efficiency. Rocket barrage achieved 73% destruction of prepared defensive positions prior to H-hour. He had studied the tactical diagrams, the neat arrows and shaded boxes that represented beach sectors and target zones. Nothing in those documents had prepared him for the visceral reality of what his ship could do, the sheer overwhelming violence of concentrated firepower delivered in industrial quantities. There was something obscene about it, he thought, not immoral but obscene in the original sense, something that should happen offstage, out of sight, too extreme for direct viewing. The Japanese on that beach had prepared for battle. They had dug their positions with care, had positioned their weapons with tactical intelligence, had steeled themselves for combat and death. They were soldiers, but what was happening to them now was not combat. It was obliteration. It was erasure. It was the application of American industrial capacity to the problem of human bodies occupying strategic terrain. The final launcher rack fired at 0620 hours. The last rocket arced toward the beach, trailing a plume of white smoke that hung in the still morning air like a question mark. Ridley's ears rang in the sudden relative silence. Relative because the destroyers and cruisers were still firing, the battleships were still lobbing 14-inch shells inland. The overall symphony of the naval bombardment continued unabated. But the rocket barrage was complete. He raised his binoculars once more and studied the beach. Where the Japanese defensive line had been, there was now only churned earth, smoke, and scattered fires burning with the peculiar intensity of white phosphorus. No movement, no return fire, no sign of organized resistance. The beach looked, he thought, like photographs he had seen of the Western Front in 1918, after months of artillery bombardment. A dead landscape, a place where the concept of military objectives had been replaced by pure negative space. "Secure from firing stations," he said into the speaking tube. "Prepare to withdraw to second position." The LSM R-194 reversed engines and began backing away from the beach, its deck crew already hosing down the launcher racks to cool the heat-stressed metal. Around the ship, the first wave of amphibious tractors churned past, heading for shore, loaded with Marines who would land on a beach already won, already secured by firepower so overwhelming that human defenders had become irrelevant. Ridley watched them go and felt nothing in particular. Not triumph, not horror, not satisfaction. Only a kind of empty awareness that war had changed again, that the gap between industrial capacity and human resilience had widened to a chasm that no amount of courage or tactical skill could bridge. The Japanese were brave. Everyone acknowledged this. They were disciplined, fanatical, willing to die to the last man. But bravery was not a defense against mathematics. Discipline meant nothing when the equations were this unbalanced. The reports that filtered back to Japanese command throughout the day were fragmentary, contradictory, and terrifying. Regimental headquarters received no communication from the coastal defense units for the first 3 hours after the landing began. When the first runner arrived from the beach, a private named Hayashi who had survived by virtue of being in the latrine trench, 200 meters from the main defensive line. His account was so extreme that the intelligence officers initially dismissed it as combat hysteria. Hayashi claimed that the Americans had used some kind of carpet bombing from ships, that the entire beach had been hit simultaneously by thousands of explosives, that men had been buried alive or simply vaporized, that the defensive positions had ceased to exist before the first landing craft touched sand. The regimental commander, Colonel Yamashita, assumed the man was describing an exceptionally heavy naval bombardment, the kind the Americans delivered before every landing. He had experienced such bombardments before. They were severe, certainly, often destructive, but survivable. Defenses could be rebuilt after the shelling ceased. Hidden reserves could emerge from deep bunkers and caves, reoccupy fighting positions, exact their toll on the invasion force. That was the doctrine, the proven methodology of Japanese defensive warfare. But as more survivors trickled inland, a sergeant here, 2 privates there, a machine gun crew that had been stationed in the reserve line and thus escaped the worst of the barrage, a consistent picture emerged. The Americans had deployed a new weapon, something the defensive doctrine had not anticipated. Not bombs from aircraft because the survivors had seen the launches from ships. Not conventional naval artillery because the volume of fire exceeded anything battleships could deliver. Rockets, some survivors said, though the word in Japanese carried implications of inaccuracy, of weapons suited only for terror attacks on civilian populations, not precision military strikes. Whatever the technical designation, the effect was clear. The coastal defenses had been effectively destroyed in less than 10 minutes, before a single American soldier had set foot on Philippine soil. Colonel Yamashita compiled the reports and forwarded them to divisional headquarters with his own assessment. The enemy possesses a ship-based area saturation weapon of exceptional destructive capacity. Conventional beach defenses are ineffective against this weapon system. Recommend immediate revision of coastal defense doctrine. The response from division was terse. Continue resistance per standing orders. Inflict maximum casualties. Death before dishonor. The Japanese military apparatus, for all its emphasis on adaptation and tactical flexibility at the small unit level, was rigidly hierarchical at higher command echelons. Doctrine changed slowly, filtered through layers of bureaucracy and military tradition that dated to the Meiji Restoration. A single report from Luzon, no matter how alarming, would not immediately alter strategic planning. But the report was not singular. Throughout January and February 1945, as American amphibious operations continued across the Pacific, similar accounts accumulated. At Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders reported wave attacks from the sea that destroyed pillboxes and gun emplacements before the marine assault began. At Okinawa, where the Japanese had prepared the most sophisticated defensive system of the Pacific War, survivors described rocket typhoons that made holding coastal positions impossible. The pattern was clear, consistent, and tactically decisive. The Americans had found a method to neutralize prepared defenses through sheer firepower density, creating a window of complete vulnerability during which landing forces could establish beachheads with minimal casualties. Lieutenant Nakamura survived the war, though the man who surrendered in September 1945 bore little resemblance to the academy graduate who had landed in the Philippines in 1942. During his captivity at the American POW camp in Cabanatuan, He was interviewed by U.S. Army intelligence officers interested in Japanese tactical responses to various weapons systems. The interview transcript, now archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, records his description of the Lingayen Gulf landing. "We expected bombardment. We had experienced bombardment many times before. We knew the Americans had superior firepower. But this was different in kind, not merely in degree. It was as if the sky had become solid, had fallen on us all at once. There was nowhere to hide, no safe position. The bunkers we had built, which had protected us from previous bombardments, were simply erased. Not damaged, erased. After it ended, I could not find the location where my command post had been. The landscape had changed completely. I understood then that we could not win. Not because we lacked courage or dedication, but because the material resources available to each side were so different that courage became meaningless. It was like trying to stop an avalanche by standing firm and refusing to move. The avalanche does not care about your courage." The interviewing officer noted in his report, "Subject displayed no bitterness or resentment when describing the rocket bombardment, only a kind of fatalistic acceptance. When asked if better fortifications could have withstood the barrage, he simply shook his head. When asked if the Japanese military had any comparable weapon, he laughed, the only time during the interview he showed any emotion. The LSM, our vessels would participate in every major amphibious operation for the remainder of the Pacific War, their effectiveness growing as doctrine and tactics evolved. By Okinawa, the Navy had refined the rocket barrage into a precise choreography, coordinating LSM, our launches with conventional naval gunfire and airstrikes to create overlapping waves of destruction that left Japanese defenses with no opportunity to recover or reorganize. The casualty ratios in amphibious assaults shifted dramatically. At Tarawa in 1943, the Marines had suffered 1 casualty for every 4 Japanese defenders killed. At Okinawa in 1945, with LSM, our vessels providing pre-landing saturation fire, the ratio had reversed. 4 Japanese casualties for every American lost in the initial landing phase. The difference was measurable in statistical tables, in after-action reports, in the letters home that young men got to write because they survived the first minutes of combat. But statistics capture only the quantifiable dimensions of military effectiveness. The psychological impact of the LSM, our rockets, exceeded their material destructiveness. Japanese defenders, even those who survived the barges physically intact, often emerged from their positions in a state of shell shock so severe that they could not effectively resist. Regimental medical reports from Japanese units engaged at Okinawa describe symptoms consistent with acute psychological trauma: inability to concentrate, uncontrollable shaking, selective mutism, dissociative episodes. The American rockets had done something that conventional weapons rarely achieved. They had broken not just the body but the will, had reached into the defended space and extracted the willingness to continue fighting. The Japanese military, analyzing these effects in their post-battle assessments, struggled with terminology. How does one describe, in the formal language of military doctrine, the experience of comprehensive helplessness? How does one incorporate into tactical training the lesson that prepared positions offer no protection, that courage and determination are insufficient, that the enemy possesses firepower so abundant they can afford to saturate entire beach sectors with explosives simply as a precautionary measure? The closest the Japanese came to articulating this was in a report from the 32nd Army at Okinawa, which included the phrase material despair. The recognition that the quantitative imbalance was so extreme that qualitative advantages in training, morale, or tactical skill could not compensate. Captain Ridley returned to Pennsylvania in October 1945 and resumed his career as a civil engineer. He never spoke publicly about his service in the Pacific, declined interview requests from military historians, and left no personal memoir. His personnel file contains a single commendation for exceptional performance in fire support operations during the Lingayen Gulf invasion, but provides no detail about what that performance entailed. His daughter, interviewed in 1998 for an oral history project, recalled that her father kept a photograph in his desk drawer. Not displayed, but present, showing a view from a ship's deck toward a distant beach obscured by smoke. She asked him once what the photograph depicted. He looked at it for a long moment before answering, "The end of an argument." That phrase, cryptic to his daughter, captures something essential about the LSM, our program and the broader American approach to Pacific warfare. The Japanese military had argued, through their defensive strategy, that determination and tactical skill could offset material disadvantage. They had argued that fortified positions manned by resolute defenders could exact such a toll on amphibious forces that the cost of victory would exceed American willingness to pay. It was a reasonable argument, grounded in historical precedent and supported by the carnage at Tarawa and Peleliu. The LSM, our vessels, and the industrial philosophy they embodied were America's response, not a counterargument in the rhetorical sense, but a material refutation, a demonstration that the debate itself was obsolete. When one side can deliver 5,000 pounds of high explosive onto a single beach sector in 90 seconds, and can do so from dozens of ships simultaneously, fortifications become temporary, determination becomes irrelevant, and the argument is not won but simply terminated by overwhelming fact. The rockets themselves were crude devices, primitive by the standards of post-war guided missiles. Each 4.5-inch M8 rocket was essentially a steel tube packed with propellant and capped with an explosive warhead, stabilized in flight by folding fins that deployed after launch. Accuracy was terrible. At maximum range of 4,500 yards, the rockets scattered across a zone hundreds of meters in diameter, with no possibility of precision targeting. They were cheap to manufacture, costing approximately $40 per unit in 1945 currency, compared to several $100s for a conventional artillery shell of comparable weight. They required no elaborate fire control systems, no complex ballistic computers, no highly trained gun crews. A sailor with 2 days of training could learn to load and fire the launcher racks. The rockets were, in engineering terms, a brute force solution to the problem of beach suppression, inefficient in the abstract, but pragmatically effective because American industry could produce them in unlimited quantities. The Japanese, analyzing captured examples after the war, were particularly struck by this aspect of American weapons design. Japanese military engineering emphasized precision, efficiency, maximizing performance within resource constraints. A Japanese weapons designer confronted with the M8 rocket would have immediately identified a dozen ways to improve accuracy, reduce weight, enhance explosive yield per unit mass. But those improvements would have required more sophisticated manufacturing, more expensive materials, longer production times. The American philosophy was different. Build something adequate rather than optimal, but build 50,000 of them rather than 5,000. Accept higher per unit costs in material inefficiency, but achieve lower per unit costs through mass production. The result was a military force that could afford to be wasteful, that could saturate a target zone with explosives not because precision was impossible, but because abundance made precision unnecessary. This philosophical difference extended far beyond weapons systems. It permeated every aspect of the Pacific War, from logistics to medical care to administrative overhead. An American infantry company in the Philippines operated with a support tail that included dedicated cooks, medical corpsmen, radio operators, jeep drivers, clerks, and supply personnel. A tooth-to-tail ratio that Japanese officers found incomprehensible and inefficient. Why devote so many resources to keeping soldiers comfortable and well-fed? Why evacuate wounded men who could no longer fight, wasting transport capacity on personnel who provided no combat value? Why supply fresh uniforms, hot meals, and mail service to men in combat zones? The Japanese military, operating under severe resource constraints, had adopted a leaner approach. Soldiers carried their own food, treated their own minor wounds, accepted that supply lines were tenuous and support minimal. This seemed, to Japanese planners, more rational, more efficient, better suited to the realities of industrial warfare where every ton of shipping capacity was precious. But the American approach, seemingly wasteful, produced a different kind of efficiency, not efficiency of resources but efficiency of combat effectiveness. Soldiers who ate hot meals and received regular mail fought better than soldiers subsisting on rice balls and disconnected from home. Wounded men who knew they would receive prompt medical evacuation fought more aggressively than men who understood that serious wounds meant abandonment and death. Units that could call on overwhelming fire support from ships and aircraft took more initiative than units that had to husband ammunition and avoid unnecessary contact. The waste, from this perspective, was not waste but investment, a recognition that the combat effectiveness of human beings was not a constant but a variable, and that maintaining high morale and physical condition produced returns that justified the logistical costs. The symbolic weight of the LSM, our vessels extended beyond their tactical utility. To the American forces, they represented technological superiority and industrial might, the ability to solve military problems through engineering innovation and mass production. To the Japanese defenders, they represented something more disturbing: the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict, the recognition that they were fighting an enemy whose resources were so vast that entire categories of weapons could be developed and deployed in quantities that made traditional defensive strategies obsolete. A Japanese officer studying intelligence reports on American weapons production would confront figures that seemed impossible. Thousands of ships built per year, tens of thousands of aircraft, millions of tons of ammunition. These numbers exceeded comprehension. They belonged to a different scale of human organization, a different paradigm of what industrialized nations could achieve. Private Yamamoto Hiroshi, captured on Okinawa and interviewed at the same POW camp where Nakamura was held, described his reaction to seeing the rocket barrage for the first time. "I had been told that Americans were soft, that they relied on machines because they lacked warrior spirit. After I saw the rocket ships fire, I understood that this was backwards. Americans relied on machines because they had so many machines that they could afford to rely on them. It was not weakness but strength, a different kind of strength than we had been taught to recognize. We prized the samurai who could defeat 10 enemies with a sword. Americans built a system where one man with a radio could summon enough firepower to destroy 1,000 enemies, which required more intelligence, more discipline, more organizational skill. I could not answer this question, but I knew that we had lost the war before it began, because we were asking the wrong questions about what made a military force effective." The Lingayen Gulf landing, supported by the rocket barrage that horrified Lieutenant Nakamura, succeeded with casualties far below pre-invasion estimates. The 6th Army lost fewer than 200 men on the first day, the majority to accidents and isolated sniper fire rather than organized resistance. The Japanese defensive positions, which had been expected to inflict thousands of casualties, simply did not exist in functional form after the rocket ships finished their work. By nightfall on January 17, 1945, American forces had pushed inland 3 miles, secured the beachhead, and established a logistics base capable of supporting further operations. The battle for Luzon would continue for months, fought in the mountains and cities of the interior, but the beach was never contested, never became the meat grinder of American planning nightmares. The LSM, our program, cost the U.S. Navy approximately $12 million in total, the price of 3 modern fighter aircraft in today's currency. That investment purchased a capability that transformed amphibious warfare, saved thousands of American lives, and contributed significantly to shortening the Pacific War. It was one of the most cost-effective weapons programs of the conflict, judged purely by the ratio of expenditure to strategic impact. Yet the LSM, our vessels, are largely forgotten today, overshadowed in popular memory by battleships and aircraft carriers, submarines and strategic bombers. They were too specialized, too ugly, too unglamorous to capture the public imagination. They looked like floating warehouses, not warships. They represented industrial pragmatism rather than martial romance. But to the men who would have died storming defended beaches without that rocket fire, the LSM, our vessels, were beautiful beyond description. Proof that somewhere in the American industrial complex, engineers and planners were thinking systematically about keeping them alive, were willing to invest resources not just in killing the enemy but in reducing friendly casualties, were treating each soldier's life as a quantifiable asset worth preserving through technological innovation. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Japanese military analysts conducted extensive reviews of tactical failures and strategic miscalculations. These reviews, compiled under American occupation supervision and later declassified, devote considerable attention to the psychological dimensions of material inferiority. One report, authored by Colonel Hara Tadashi of the General Staff, includes this assessment. The decisive factor in the Pacific War was not tactical superiority or strategic brilliance, but industrial capacity translated into battlefield abundance. American forces fought as if resources were unlimited because, from their perspective, resources were effectively unlimited. This created a psychological freedom that manifested as tactical aggressiveness, willingness to accept risk, and rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. Japanese forces, operating under constant resource constraints, developed a psychology of scarcity that manifested as rigid adherence to doctrine, unwillingness to expend ammunition freely, and defensive mindsets. Both forces fought with courage and skill, but courage within abundance produces different behaviors than courage within scarcity. This observation cuts to the philosophical heart of the LSM, our program, and the broader American way of war. The rockets were not merely weapons. They were expressions of a society that had industrialized so thoroughly that it could afford to be generous with violence, that could saturate military problems with material until those problems ceased to exist. A Japanese commander planning a defensive position had to consider ammunition availability, supply line vulnerability, the impossibility of replacement or reinforcement. An American commander planning an assault could reasonably expect that any identified strongpoint would be buried under sufficient explosives to neutralize it, that air support would be available on call, that artillery would fire for effect rather than rationing shells, that logistics would keep pace with tactical demands. These different planning contexts produced different tactical cultures, different approaches to problem solving, and ultimately different outcomes. The war ended in August 1945, terminated not by conventional amphibious assaults, but by atomic weapons whose destructive capacity exceeded even the LSM, our barrages by orders of magnitude. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, which would have employed rocket ships in unprecedented numbers, never occurred. The LSM, our vessels, were quietly decommissioned in the post-war drawdown, their specialized equipment removed, their hulls returned to cargo service or scrapped. A few survived into the Korean War, providing fire support during the Incheon landing and other operations, but by the mid-1950s the program had been discontinued entirely, replaced by more sophisticated guided missile systems that could deliver equivalent firepower with precision rather than saturation. The crude M8 rockets, which had terrified Japanese defenders from Luzon to Okinawa, became historical curiosities, examples of wartime improvisation superseded by technological progress. But the legacy of the rocket ships persisted in military doctrine and strategic thinking. The lesson that American planners drew from the LSM, our program, was not build more rocket ships, but rather firepower density matters more than platform sophistication. This principle would inform weapons development for decades. The emphasis on rapid-fire artillery systems, the proliferation of cluster munitions, the development of multiple launch rocket systems like the M270 MLRS that could saturate target zones with submunitions. The underlying philosophy remained constant. When facing fortified positions or area targets, the solution was not precision but volume, not elegant design but overwhelming quantity delivered in compressed time. The LSM, our vessels, had proven this principle in the most demanding laboratory imaginable. Actual combat against a determined, skilled enemy fighting from prepared positions. The principle worked. The proof was written in the casualty ratios, in the speed of beachhead establishment, in the beaches that fell silent before the first landing craft arrived. Lieutenant Nakamura, in his final interview session before repatriation to Japan in 1946, was asked if the rocket barrage experience had changed his view of warfare or military service. His answer, translated from Japanese by the camp interpreter, reads, "War is a dialogue between technologies and doctrines, between industrial capacities and human will. At Lingayen Gulf, I learned that the dialogue can become a monologue when one side possesses such overwhelming material advantages that the other side cannot participate meaningfully in the conversation. This does not diminish the courage or sacrifice of soldiers on the inferior side. Courage is not relative to odds of success. But it does mean that courage alone cannot determine outcomes when the material imbalance exceeds certain thresholds. The rocket ships represented that threshold. After experiencing that barrage, I knew that no amount of determination or tactical skill could overcome the simple mathematical fact that Americans could deliver more explosives onto our positions in 10 minutes than we could absorb or deflect. The war was decided by industrial production, by access to resources, by the ability to translate raw materials into finished weapons at a pace that exceeded our capacity to destroy them in use. We fought with honor and lost inevitably. Those two facts are not in contradiction. The interpreter, a Nisei sergeant from California who had fought with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe, added a personal note to the interview transcript. Subject spoke with neither bitterness nor pride. only a kind of weary clarity. I was struck by his lack of resentment toward American weapons or tactics. He seemed to view the technological disparity as a natural phenomenon, like being caught in a typhoon, something overwhelming and indifferent to human will. He asked, at the end of the session, whether the rocket ships had saved American lives. When I confirmed this was their purpose, he nodded and said, "Then they served their function." I did not know how to respond to this. The beach at Lingayen Gulf today is quiet, a stretch of gray volcanic sand lined with palm trees, and the occasional concrete bunker ruin half buried in dunes. Fishermen launch outrigger canoes from the shore where the rocket barrage once erased an entire defensive line in 7 minutes and 40 seconds. The water is clear and warm, popular with domestic tourists who have no knowledge of what happened here in January 1945. There is a small monument near San Fabian, a concrete pillar with a bronze plaque that commemorates the landing of the 6th Army, but it makes no mention of the LSM, our vessels or the rocket barrage that preceded the assault. The ships were too specialized, too technical, too far outside the traditional narrative of heroic infantry combat to merit inclusion in the simplified history that monuments convey. But history is written in layers, and beneath the surface narrative of battles and campaigns runs a deeper current of technological evolution and strategic transformation. The LSM, our program, was a turning point in that deeper history, a moment when industrial capacity crossed a threshold and became not just a military advantage but a qualitatively different kind of power, something that rendered traditional military virtues obsolete in specific contexts. After Lingayen Gulf, Japanese commanders knew that beach defenses were doomed, that the initial confrontation with American amphibious forces would be decided by firepower ratios too extreme for courage to bridge. They adapted by moving defenses inland, by abandoning the water's edge in favor of depth and attrition, by accepting that the landing itself could not be contested. This was not a tactical adjustment but a strategic capitulation to material reality. The rockets that Lieutenant Nakamura experienced in his bunker on that January morning were, in a sense, ambassadors from the future messengers delivering the news that warfare had changed, that the relationship between human will and military outcomes had been fundamentally altered by industrial scale. The message was delivered at high velocity, in explosive punctuation marks, with a volume that permitted no misunderstanding. Those who survived carried the message inland, spread it through the defensive positions, allowed it to propagate through the Japanese military apparatus until it became a new kind of conventional wisdom. The beaches cannot be held, the Americans possess too much fire, courage is insufficient against mathematics. The floating artillery of the LSM, our vessels, demonstrated a particular American genius for translating industrial abundance into tactical advantage, for solving military problems through engineering rather than elan. There was nothing romantic about the rockets, nothing that stirred the martial imagination or embodied traditional warrior virtues. They were crude, inaccurate, wasteful of materials, and overwhelmingly effective. They represented a different philosophy of warfare, one that privileged results over methods, that treated combat as a technical problem amenable to engineering solutions, that recognized that preserving friendly lives through superior firepower was not cowardice but intelligent resource allocation. The Japanese military, steeped in Bushido traditions that elevated personal courage and willingness to die, struggled to comprehend this approach, to articulate a doctrine that could counter an enemy whose first instinct was to bury problems under explosives rather than confront them directly. The horror that Lieutenant Nakamura and his men experienced on that beach was not simply the horror of explosives and death. Soldiers expect those risks, accept them as the conditions of their profession. The deeper horror was the recognition of futility, the visceral understanding that their prepared positions and determined resistance meant nothing against an enemy who could afford to waste tonnage of ammunition on precautionary bombardments. They had dug bunkers and positioned weapons with care. They had rehearsed fields of fire and mutual support protocols. They had done everything that military doctrine prescribed, had prepared to sell their lives at maximum cost. And then the rockets came and all their preparation was simply deleted, removed from existence before it could be tested in combat. The horror was existential. Not the fear of death, but the fear of meaningless death, of sacrifice that achieved nothing because the material disparity was so vast that individual or unit-level excellence could not affect outcomes. In the end, the story of the LSM, our vessels, and the Lingayen Gulf barrage is not primarily about weapons or tactics, but about the nature of total war between industrial societies with radically different resource bases. Japan entered the Pacific War as a nation of 70 million with limited natural resources, dependent on imports of oil, rubber, iron, and other strategic materials. The United States entered with a population of 130 million, continental self-sufficiency in nearly all strategic resources, and an industrial capacity that exceeded the combined output of all Axis powers. This disparity was knowable in 1941, was in fact the reason many Japanese leaders opposed war with America. But knowing an abstraction is different from experiencing the concrete manifestation of that abstraction in the form of endless convoys, unlimited ammunition, and weapons like the LSM are rockets that could only exist in a military force so wealthy it could afford to be profligate with explosives. The rockets falling on Lingayen Gulf were not just projectiles. They were arguments, material proofs of an economic thesis written in cordite and steel. Each salvo said, "We have so much that we can afford to waste it." Each barrage said, "We value our soldiers' lives enough to bury your positions in fire before risking them in assault." Each minute of sustained bombardment said, "This is not the limit of what we can do, merely what we choose to do in this specific context." The Japanese military could counter individual tactics, could adapt to specific weapons, could match American courage and often exceed American tactical skill at unit level. But they could not counter the fundamental message of the LSM, our barrage. That abundance itself was a weapon, that the ability to be wasteful was a strategic asset, that industrial capacity had become not just a supporting element of military power but its defining characteristic in modern war. Lieutenant Nakamura, emerging from his collapsed bunker into the transformed landscape of Lingayen Gulf, understood this message instantly and completely, not through analysis but through the direct physical experience of what American industrial power meant in practice. In the years after the war, he would become an engineer, would help rebuild Japan's industrial infrastructure, would watch his defeated nation rise from ash to become an economic power in its own right. He never forgot the rockets. In private moments, according to his daughter's recollections, he would sometimes mention them, not with bitterness or trauma, but with a kind of analytical respect, the way an engineer might describe a particularly elegant solution to a difficult problem. "They were very practical," he supposedly said once, late in life. "Everything excessive, nothing elegant, but exactly suited to their purpose. Very American. The floating artillery is gone now, scrapped and forgotten, but its lesson remains written in the doctrine of modern militaries. That firepower has become so abundant, so easily delivered, that the defense of fixed positions against an enemy with air and naval superiority is essentially impossible. That lesson was purchased at Lingayen Gulf and a dozen other Pacific beaches, paid for in Japanese lives and American rockets, validated by the silence that fell over those beaches after the barges ended. A silence broken only by the sound of landing craft engines, carrying men who would live through the war because somewhere in the American industrial complex, engineers had designed a floating warehouse that could scream death at the rate of 1,000 rockets per minute, and commanders had decided that this was a reasonable expenditure of resources if it meant their soldiers would walk onto contested beaches and find nothing contesting them anymore. That is the heritage of the LSM, our vessels. Not glory or honor or martial romance, but the cold comfort of overwhelming force applied with industrial efficiency, the knowledge that some wars are won not by superior warriors but by superior production, and the understanding that horror, experienced by the enemy, is sometimes the price of preservation for one's own. The rockets falling on Lingayen Gulf carried no moral lesson, no enlightenment, no redemption, only mathematics, physics, and the implacable logic of industrial warfare conducted by a society wealthy enough to measure human life in dollars and find the equation favorable.